Sketcher constraints are just rules that you impose on sketch geometry. So let's edit definition of sketch 1 over here, and you can see with the entities in the sketch, I have a whole lot of different dimensions visible. They're cluttering up the screen. So from the in-graphics toolbar, I'm going to turn off the dimension display. And a couple recommendations before I show you how to apply constraints to geometry. First, add constraints before dimensioning, just because as you add constraints, those weak dimensions, the suggestions from Creo Parametric, will go away and make your sketch less complicated. Also, rather than picking the constraint first, I recommend picking the geometry, because in the mini toolbar in Creo 4.0 and later, and in the right mouse button menu in Creo 3.0 and earlier, you'll be able to select any constraints that can be applied to that geometry. So before adding constraints, let me switch to the sketch view so my sketch is parallel to the computer screen. And we'll just go through these constraints one by one. So for the vertical constraint, you can pick the icon from the ribbon and then pick the entities that you want to make vertical. You can see how the sketch is updating. Also, you can select 2 points to make them line up vertically. So for example, I can pick this point here and this point over here, and they're adjusted so that they are in line with one another. For the horizontal constraint, again, you can pick the horizontal icon from the ribbon and then pick the entity that you want, or I'm going to middle mouse click to get out of horizontal. You can pick an entity, and then you see in my mini toolbar, I can choose this button to make that line horizontal, and the same thing applies. You can pick a couple different entities like these 2 points, and I'm just holding down the control key, and in the mini toolbar, I can make them horizontal. For perpendicular, I'm just going to click the icon in the ribbon, pick 2 entities, one after another, and they end up being perpendicular. Middle mouse button, just get out of the command. If I pick 2 entities, holding down the control key in the mini toolbar, you can see that we can choose the perpendicular constraint. Tangency, same applies. Pick the tangent icon and pick 2 entities, and they'll be made tangent to one another. I also want to point out that as I'm adding these constraints, you can see that we have these little symbols on the computer screen that tell us that the constraint has been applied. Let me middle mouse button get out of tangent mode. You can see that if I hover my mouse over it, it'll tell me what that little symbol means. Alright, just like I showed before, instead of picking the tangent command from the ribbon first, I can pick 2 entities while holding down the control key, and from the mini toolbar, choose the tangent command. And one thing I want to mention is that in Creo Parametric 4.0 and earlier, in the mini toolbar, it uses these symbols. In Creo Parametric 3.0 and earlier, when you hold down the right mouse button, the word is going to be spelled out for the constraint. Okay, that's good for tangent. Next up is midpoint. So for midpoint, I will click on the command here. And by the way, if you're unsure how to use the command, just read the message area down at the bottom of the screen. It tells me to select a point and a line or an arc. So for example, I can select this point here and this line, and it makes it line up in the midpoint. Let me middle mouse button to get out of the midpoint command. Same thing applies. I can select a point, hold down the control key, and here is the midpoint command from the mini toolbar. Symmetry requires you to have a center line first, and it can either be a datum center line or a sketching center line. And in another video, I'll explain the difference between the datum entity commands and the ones from the sketching group. Basically, these will create a datum feature later on. So I will create a center line and click where I want it to start and then end. Similarly, if you hold down the right mouse button, you can get to center line from the right mouse button menu. All right, put in another center line there. And when you use the symmetry command, it tells you that you're going to select a center line and two vertices to make them symmetric. The order doesn't matter. You can pick the center line first, left, and then left click on the 2 points. And by the way, I was not holding down the control key when I'm doing that. You don't have to hold down control for the center line command. Similarly, I'm still in the symmetric command. This time I'll just pick point, point, and then center line, and then it adjusts to make those 2 points symmetric about the center line. Again, pick points first or center line first. The order does not matter. All right, next up, the equal command. So let's select equals, and I'll pick this line and this line over here. And you can see that there's a little equal sign and then the number 1. That's how you can distinguish between different pairs of same length entities. For example, if I select now this line over here and this line over there, I'll actually end up making them the same group. Let me get back to the equal command. Let's select this line and this line over there. You'll notice now that we have a number 2 over there, so it means that this pair of equal length entities is different than this pair, actually this group of 4 equal length entities over there. For the equals command, you can also use them on arcs and circles. So for example, I can pick this circle over here. Oops, let me go back to the equals command, pick this circle and then this circle over there, and they have the same radius and diameter now. And next up with the parallel command, oops, looks like I took care of all the different entities in here. I have nothing that I can make parallel. Let me throw in a couple of lines over here. With parallel, just like the name implies, pick 2 entities and they will end up being parallel to one another. So those are the different constraints. I mentioned how you can just hover your mouse over one of these different entities and come here, there. It'll tell me what the constraint is. From the constraint dropdown, you do have the ability to pick a constraint and then constrain, explain, but it's really kind of unnecessary because, again, just hover your mouse over the name of the constraint. The one advantage is that it will highlight the different entities in red when you do that. Another thing to mention is that Creo Parametric will not allow you to over dimension or over constrain your sketch. For example, let me turn on my dimension display again. I know we have a lot of dimensions on here, but let's say that I try to make this entity and this entity equal length. Well, because of the combination of constraints that I have, that would end up over dimensioning and over constraining my sketch. So in this case here, I have the option to undo, or I could delete one of the different constraints. If you have dimensions in here that are part of the conflict, you could turn them into a reference dimension. Then there's the explain button over here. So for example, if I want to, I could say, hey, you know, this horizontal constraint, let's delete that. And now I'm able to have that dimension that I placed in the sketch. All right, so that is good. Let me hit the check mark. A last thing to mention about sketching. If you go to File, Options, and then Sketcher, you do have the ability to turn off the assumptions that Creo Parametric is making as you sketch. So for example, if you want to turn off horizontal snapping or vertical snapping, etc., for the different kinds of constraints, you can do this from here. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you can. And you'll notice if you hover your mouse over these different options, it'll tell you the corresponding config.pro option that you can apply so that when you launch Creo Parametric, it'll remember your preference. Also, one other thing to mention about the options for sketching, you have this snapping sensitivity, and by default the value is very high. In other words, Creo Parametric will jump to assumptions when you're sketching as to whether things should be equal length or symmetric or tangent, so forth and so on. And if you find that it's just snapping way too much, you can decrease the sensitivity. And again, this is controlled by a config.pro option, which you can see is Sketcher Snap Sensitivity. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindshield.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, write a comment, and click the subscribe button to be informed when new videos are uploaded. Thank you very much.